The day started like any other for Lisa Carter, a hard-working single mom balancing her job, her son, and a mountain of responsibilities. Lisa wasn't looking for trouble. She never did. Her focus was on providing the best life she could for her 8-year-old son, Marcus. Little did she know, her routine grocery store run was about to turn into a nightmare. Lisa parked her worn sedan in a spot near the store's entrance, already making mental notes of what she needed to grab before rushing back home to prepare dinner. She had no idea that a rookie police officer, fresh out of the academy and eager to make a name for himself, was watching her every move from across the lot. Officer Jake Daniels was new to the force, and he carried himself with a confidence that some might call arrogance. To him, the world was black and white, right or wrong. He believed he could spot trouble from a mile away, and today, Lisa Carter was in his sights. A woman of color, dressed in comfortable clothes, and driving an older car. Jake thought it looked suspicious. Lisa felt the officer's eyes on her as she stepped out of the car, but she brushed it off. She had more important things to worry about than a cop who clearly had too much time on his hands. Marcus tugged at her hand, asking if they could grab his favorite cereal. She smiled at him, trying to stay upbeat even as the weight of her busy day pressed on her shoulders. Inside the store, Lisa quickly moved through the aisles, grabbing only the essentials. She didn't notice Officer Daniels had followed her in, radioing in what he claimed was suspicious activity. To him, her calm demeanor was an act, and her presence in the store, a place she frequented weekly, seemed to him like she didn't belong. When Lisa and Marcus exited the store with their bags, she barely had time to unlock the car before the officer approached, his voice sharp and commanding. "Ma'am, can I see your ID?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for questions. Lisa frowned, taken aback. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. Jake didn't answer her question. Instead, he repeated his demand, this time placing his hand on his holstered weapon. The gesture wasn't lost on Lisa. Marcus clung to her leg, his small hands trembling. "Mom, what's happening?" Marcus whispered, his big, scared eyes darting between his mother and the officer. Lisa crouched down to comfort her son, whispering reassuring words she wasn't sure she believed herself. When she stood back up, she held out her driver's license, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid escalating the situation. But Jake wasn't interested in her compliance. He had already decided she was guilty of what he hadn't figured out yet, but he was determined to make something stick. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered, his voice growing harsher. Lisa hesitated, confusion and fear flashing across her face. "Officer, I don't understand. What's this about?" "You're under arrest," Jake snapped, reaching for his handcuffs. "For what?" Lisa's voice cracked, a mix of outrage and disbelief. "Resisting arrest and suspicious activity," he said, though he had no real evidence to support either claim. Before she could protest further, Jake cuffed her hands behind her back, ignoring her pleas and the terrified cries of her son. By the time Lisa was forced into the back of the squad car, neighbors had gathered, their faces a mix of shock and anger. But Jake didn't care. He was too wrapped up in his own sense of authority, too convinced he was doing the right thing. As the car sped away, Lisa stared out the window, tears streaming down her face. She wondered how her life had spiraled into this nightmare, and she worried about Marcus, left behind with a stranger. What Jake didn't realize was that his actions that day would set off a chain of events he could never have anticipated. The truth was about to come to light in a way that would leave everyone stunned, especially him. The ride to the station was silent except for Lisa's quiet sobs and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Her mind raced with questions, each more desperate than the last. What would happen to Marcus? Would anyone look after him until she could clear up this mess? She tried to block out the ache in her chest as she thought of his little face, pressed against the window, watching her being taken away. Officer Daniels, on the other hand, sat stone-faced, convinced he had done his duty. In his mind, Lisa fit a profile he had convinced himself was always up to no good. He wasn't malicious, not exactly, but his arrogance blinded him to his own biases. Jake thought he was making the streets safer, one arrest at a time, no matter how flimsy his reasons were. At the station, Lisa was processed like any other criminal. The harsh fluorescent lights and cold, sterile walls made her feel small and powerless. The officers on duty exchanged uneasy glances as Jake filled out his report. Even they could see something didn't add up. Lisa's record was spotless, her demeanor calm despite the humiliation she was enduring. But Jake waved off their concerns. She was acting suspicious, he said firmly, ignoring the murmurs of doubt. Meanwhile, back at the parking lot, a small crowd of neighbors gathered around Marcus. A kind older woman, Mrs. Jenkins, took him by the hand. She had known Lisa for years and knew this had to be some terrible mistake. "Don't you worry, sweetie," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "We'll make sure your mama's okay." But Marcus was inconsolable, tears streaking his face. He couldn't understand why his mom had been taken away, why the man in the uniform had been so mean. To him, police officers were supposed to help people, not hurt them. As word spread through the community, phones began to ring. Lisa's sister, Kim, was the first to arrive at the station, demanding answers. Kim was fierce and protective, the kind of woman who didn't back down easily. She had always been Lisa's rock, and she wasn't about to let her sister face this alone. "What exactly is she being charged with?" Kim asked, her voice sharp. Jake barely looked up from his desk. "Suspicious activity and resisting arrest," he said, as if those vague words were enough to justify what he'd done. Kim's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious activity? Is that code for being a black woman running errands with her child? Because that's all she was doing." Jake bristled at her tone. "Ma'am, if you have a complaint, you can file it. Otherwise, I suggest you let us do our job." Kim was about to snap back when another officer, a seasoned veteran named Sergeant Miller, intervened. He had been watching the scene unfold from the start, and something about it didn't sit right with him. "Daniels, can I have a word?" Miller said, gesturing for Jake to follow him into a nearby office. Once inside, Miller didn't hold back. "What's going on here, Jake? This doesn't look good." Jake crossed his arms, defensive. "She was acting shady. I was just following my instincts." "Your instincts?" Miller raised an eyebrow. "Or your assumptions, because I've been on this job a long time, and let me tell you, those two aren't the same." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but Miller cut him off. "You need to be damn sure before you put cuffs on someone, especially a mother with her kid right there. This isn't just about you proving a point." Jake left the office feeling uneasy, but he refused to admit he might have been wrong. Instead, he doubled down, convinced that if he looked hard enough, he'd find something to justify the arrest. Meanwhile, Lisa sat in a holding cell, her hands trembling as she held her head in her hands. The humiliation was unbearable, but her biggest worry was Marcus. She couldn't shake the image of his scared face, the way he had clung to her as if letting go would mean losing her forever. She thought about the life she had built for him, how hard she had worked to keep him safe and happy. She had never asked for much, never expected anything to come easy. But this was a blow she hadn't seen coming. Hours passed, and Lisa's fear slowly gave way to determination. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, and she wasn't about to let Jake Daniels or anyone else strip her of her dignity. Back in the community, the news of Lisa's arrest spread like wildfire. Neighbors who knew her as a kind, hardworking mom began to rally together. They started calling local activists and reaching out to the media, determined to shine a light on what they saw as an injustice. By the time the sun set, the story was already gaining traction. Reporters showed up outside the station, cameras rolling as they interviewed neighbors and community leaders. "She's a good woman," Mrs. Jenkins told one reporter. "She didn't deserve this. That officer made a mistake, and he needs to be held accountable." Inside the station, the growing attention wasn't lost on Jake. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt. Had he let his eagerness to prove himself cloud his judgment? But instead of owning up to his mistake, he dug in deeper, hoping the evidence would somehow back him up. But there was no evidence, no stolen items, no illegal activity, nothing to suggest Lisa had done anything wrong. As the hours ticked by, the pressure on Jake and the department mounted. Calls flooded the station, demanding Lisa's release. Activists planned a peaceful protest outside. their signs and chants echoing the same message: justice for Lisa. Jake found himself in an uncomfortable spotlight, his actions scrutinized by everyone from his colleagues to his superiors. But the real test was still to come, a courtroom where the truth would finally come to light. Lisa's first court appearance was scheduled for the next morning, and she would soon find herself standing before a judge who had seen his fair share of cases like this. What no one knew yet, not even Lisa, was that the verdict would shake the very foundation of the system. The night dragged on for Lisa as she sat in the holding cell, cold and exhausted. The metallic clink of the cell door and the distant murmurs of officers working late became an endless loop in her mind. She tried to rest, leaning her head against the wall, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus. She imagined him crying himself to sleep, scared and confused, wondering why she wasn't there to tuck him in. Across town, Kim sat in Lisa's small apartment, doing her best to comfort Marcus. She had brought him home after Mrs. Jenkins stepped in to care for him at the scene, but the boy's heartbreak was palpable. He refused to eat and sat on the couch clutching the teddy bear Lisa had given him on his last birthday. "Where's Mommy?" he asked, his voice a fragile whisper. "She'll be back soon, baby," Kim said, brushing his curls from his face. "Your mom's strong, okay? We're going to make sure she comes home." But Kim wasn't as confident as she sounded. While she held it together for Marcus, her heart ached with anger and fear. The system wasn't always kind to people like her sister, and she knew how quickly things could spiral if they didn't act fast. She stayed up late, calling everyone she could think of, friends, legal contacts, even local reporters who might help bring attention to the situation. Back at the station, Jake Daniels sat in the break room, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He couldn't shake the looks his colleagues had given him, the quiet judgment in their eyes. Sergeant Miller's words echoed in his head. Asterisk, your assumptions aren't facts, asterisk. Jake tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. He told himself that Lisa's calm demeanor had been a cover, that she was hiding something. But deep down, a tiny seed of doubt had begun to grow. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew he hadn't handled things the way he should have. In another part of the station, Sergeant Miller was reviewing the case file. There wasn't much to go on. No stolen items, no contraband, no evidence of any wrongdoing. It didn't sit right with him. Miller had been on the force for over 20 years, and he'd seen plenty of rookies like Jake, too eager to prove themselves and too blind to see their mistakes. The community was still buzzing with outrage. By morning, a crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for Lisa," and "End racial profiling." Local news stations set up cameras to capture the growing protest. Lisa's arrest had struck a chord with people who had seen too many stories like hers, stories of innocent people being unfairly targeted because of the color of their skin. Inside the courthouse, Lisa was brought into the courtroom, her wrists still cuffed. She wore the same clothes from the day before, wrinkled and stained from her long night in the cell. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Kim, who gave her a reassuring nod. The judge, an older man with a reputation for fairness, entered the room. He looked over the case file, his expression unreadable. As the proceedings began, Lisa's court-appointed lawyer stood to present her case. It wasn't the best setup. Public defenders were often overworked and underprepared, but Lisa was grateful for anyone willing to fight for her. The prosecution, led by a young and overzealous attorney, argued that Jake Daniels had acted within his authority. They painted a picture of Lisa as a potential threat, though their claims lacked any real substance. When it was Lisa's turn to speak, she stood, her voice trembling but steady. She explained everything: how she'd been running errands with her son, how she had complied with the officer's orders, and how she had been arrested without any explanation. "I'm not a criminal," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm a mother. My only priority that day was getting groceries for my son." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Even the judge seemed moved, his brow furrowing as he listened. Outside the courtroom, Jake stood by a window, watching the protesters chant and wave their signs. He hadn't expected things to escalate like this. Part of him wanted to walk away, to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. But another part of him, the part that still believed he was a good officer, knew he had to see this through. Jake's perspective was beginning to shift. He thought about Lisa's son, the fear in his eyes as he clung to his mother. For the first time, Jake considered what it must have been like for Lisa, being torn away from her child for no reason other than his own unfounded suspicions. Back in the courtroom, the judge asked to review the body cam footage from the arrest. The video showed everything: the calm way Lisa had spoken to Jake, her compliance, and the lack of any real justification for her arrest. The courtroom was silent as the footage played, the weight of the evidence, or lack thereof, speaking volumes. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I've seen enough," he said, his tone firm but measured. The room tensed, everyone waiting to hear what he would say next. Jake stood just outside the door, his heart pounding. He had convinced himself that this was just another routine case, but now he wasn't so sure. As the judge prepared to deliver his decision, Lisa took a deep breath, clutching the edge of the table. She knew this moment could change everything, for her, for Marcus, and for everyone who had rallied behind her. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as the judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers in front of him. Lisa sat rigid in her seat, her pulse pounding in her ears. Kim reached out from the gallery, her hand clenched into a fist as if willing her sister's strength from afar. The protesters outside were louder now, their chants audible even through the thick walls of the courthouse. The judge took a moment before speaking, his voice low and deliberate. "I've reviewed the evidence presented, including the officer's report and the body cam footage. What I've seen raises serious concerns." He paused, looking directly at Lisa. "Miss Carter, I understand this has been a traumatic experience for you and your son. Let me assure you that this court takes these matters very seriously." For a brief moment, it felt like hope might finally break through the storm cloud that had been hanging over Lisa. But just as quickly, her relief was tempered by the judge's unreadable expression. He turned his attention to Jake Daniels, who had reluctantly entered the courtroom and now stood near the back, his face pale. "Officer Daniels," the judge said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade, "I would like to hear from you directly. Please step forward." Jake's heart sank. He hadn't expected to be called upon, and every step toward the front of the courtroom felt heavier than the last. The eyes of the community, the media, and his fellow officers were all on him. For the first time in his short career, he felt exposed, his authority stripped down to its core. "Do you believe you had probable cause to arrest Miss Carter?" the judge asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. Jake hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. He wanted to say yes, to defend his actions and justify his decisions, but the truth was staring him in the face, undeniable and unforgiving. I thought I did at the time," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge's gaze didn't waver. "And now? After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimony, do you still believe your actions were justified?" Jakes swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel the walls closing in, the tension in the room almost suffocating. Every instinct told him to dig in, to protect himself. But something about the way Lisa sat there, her dignity intact despite everything, made him pause. "No, Your Honor," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I was wrong." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a stunned silence. Lisa's heart raced as she processed his words, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, anger, and disbelief. Kim's jaw dropped, her fists unclenching as she turned to look at Jake, her eyes narrowing with a mix of satisfaction and lingering resentment. The judge nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "Thank you for your honesty, Officer Daniels. It takes courage to admit a mistake, especially one of this magnitude." But the tension in the room didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew heavier. The judge wasn't finished, and everyone knew it. "Miss Carter," he said, turning his attention back to Lisa, "while I appreciate Officer Daniels' admission, this court must consider the broader implications of what occurred here. The actions taken against you were not only unwarranted but also indicative of a deeper problem, one that extends beyond this single incident." Lisa felt her chest tighten. The judge's words were measured, but they carried a gravity that made it clear this was far from over. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown larger, their chants now a deafening roar. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras trained on the steps where Lisa would eventually emerge. Among them was a young journalist named Maya, who had been following the story closely. She knew this case wasn't just about one woman's wrongful arrest. It was a flashpoint for a community long fed up with systemic injustices. As Maya prepared for her live report, she caught sight of Marcus, standing on the steps with Kim. The boy's face was pressed against the courthouse door's glass, his eyes wide with worry. Maya's heart ached for him, knowing how much this moment would shape his understanding of the world. Back inside, the judge leaned forward, his hands clasped on the bench. Before I make my ruling, I want to address everyone in this room, particularly the officers present. The power entrusted to you as members of law enforcement is not a privilege to be taken lightly. It is a responsibility, a duty to serve and protect without bias or prejudice. Jake felt the sting of those words as if they were directed solely at him. He shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his mistakes pressing down harder than ever. The judge glanced at the clock, his expression grave. This case has illuminated not just the failure of one officer's judgment, but a systemic issue that demands immediate attention. My ruling will reflect that reality. Lisa held her breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Would justice be served? Would her life ever go back to normal? But the judge wasn't ready to give his verdict just yet. Instead, he called for a brief recess, giving everyone a moment to process the gravity of the situation. As the gavel struck and the room began to stir, Lisa felt the tension in her body ease, but only slightly. The uncertainty of what lay ahead still loomed over her like a dark shadow. As she turned to leave the courtroom, her eyes met Jake's for a brief moment. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen before, remorse. It wasn't enough to erase what he had done, but it was a start. Kim was waiting for her just outside the doors, pulling her into a tight hug. "We're not done yet," Kim whispered fiercely, "but we're going to see this through." Lisa nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Marcus, for her community, and for every person who had ever been silenced or ignored. As the crowd outside erupted into cheers at the sight of her, Lisa felt a surge of strength. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she believed she could win. As Lisa stepped outside the courthouse, the crowd surged toward her, their chants of support filling the air. For a moment, she felt the warmth of their solidarity, but it wasn't enough to erase the storm brewing inside her. Kim stayed close, holding Marcus's hand tightly as reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing. Lisa kept her head high, but the exhaustion of the past 24 hours clung to her like a weight she couldn't shake. Just as the group reached the edge of the crowd, a man in a crisp suit approached them, holding a briefcase. He looked out of place among the chaos, his demeanor calm and composed. "Miss Carter," he called, his voice cutting through the noise. Lisa turned, her brow furrowing. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously. "My name is Thomas Reed," he said, extending a business card. "I'm a civil rights attorney. I've been following your case, and I believe we need to talk." Kim stepped forward, her skepticism evident. "Why now? Where were you when my sister was being dragged through this mess?" Thomas didn't flinch. "I wanted to see how today's hearing unfolded before stepping in. Now that I've seen the judge's response and the officer's admission, I believe we have a strong case, not just for your defense, but for holding the department accountable." Lisa hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. The idea of taking on the police department felt overwhelming, but she couldn't deny the anger simmering beneath her exhaustion. "I don't know," she said finally. "I just want to focus on getting through this first." Thomas nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it. But think about it. This isn't just about you. It's about preventing this from happening to anyone else. Here's my card. Call me when you're ready." Lisa took the card reluctantly, slipping it into her pocket as Kim glared at Thomas. "We'll see," Kim muttered before steering Lisa and Marcus away from the crowd. As they made their way back to Lisa's apartment, Marcus clung to her side, his small hand clutching hers like a lifeline. "Are you okay, Mommy?" he asked softly, his wide eyes filled with worry. "I'm okay, baby," Lisa said, forcing a smile. "Everything's going to be fine." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Later that evening, as Lisa and Kim sat in the living room discussing the next steps, there was a sudden knock at the door. Kim tensed, her eyes darting toward the clock. It was late, too late for casual visitors. Lisa cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. On the other side stood a woman she didn't recognize, blonde, in her late 30s, and wearing a professional suit. Lisa hesitated before opening the door slightly. "Can I help you?" she asked wearily. The woman held up a badge. "My name is Detective Susan Hayes. I'm with Internal Affairs. I'd like to speak with you about your case." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. "Internal Affairs?" Susan glanced around, lowering her voice. "Can I come in? This isn't a conversation we should have in the hallway." Kim stepped forward, her protective instincts kicking in. "What's this about?" Susan hesitated, then said, "There's more to this situation than you realize, and I believe Officer Daniels may not have acted alone." The words hit Lisa like a punch to the gut. She opened the door wider, motioning for Susan to come inside. Kim crossed her arms, her expression skeptical but intrigued. Susan sat down, her demeanor professional but tense. "First, let me say I'm sorry for what you've been through. The reason I'm here is because there are inconsistencies in Officer Daniels' report, and they suggest a larger issue within the department." Lisa exchanged a look with Kim, her mind racing. "What kind of issue?" Susan leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's a group within the precinct, officers who believe in taking the law into their own hands. They've been operating under the radar, targeting people they claim are problems, even if there's no evidence to support it. Daniels was recruited recently, and your case may have been part of an initiation." Kim's jaw dropped, her eyes blazing with anger. "Are you serious? They used my sister as some kind of test." Susan nodded grimly. "I can't prove it yet, but I have my suspicions. That's why I need your help. If we can expose this group, we can bring them to justice and make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Lisa felt a surge of fury mixed with fear. The idea that her arrest had been part of some twisted game made her stomach turn. But it also lit a fire inside her. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady. Susan pulled out a folder, placing it on the table. "I need you to look at these photos and tell me if you recognize anyone. These are officers I suspect are involved." Lisa opened the folder, her hands trembling. As she flipped through the photos, her breath caught. One of the faces was painfully familiar. It was the officer who had stood silently behind Jake during her arrest. "That's him," she said, pointing to the photo. "He was there when Daniels arrested me. He didn't say anything, but he was watching the whole time." Susan nodded, her expression grim. "That's Officer Brad Larkin. He's been on my radar for months." Kim leaned forward, her voice sharp. "What are you going to do about it?" Susan sighed. "I'm building a case, but I need more evidence. That's why I came to you. If you're willing to testify, it could be the key to bringing them down." Lisa hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She knew the risks. Testifying could make her a target, and the thought of putting Marcus in danger terrified her. But she also knew she couldn't stay silent. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice firm. "I won't let them get away with this." Kim reached over, squeezing her hand. "We're with you," she said, her voice filled with determination. Susan nodded, standing up to leave. "Thank you, Miss Carter. I'll be in touch soon." As the door closed behind her, Lisa felt a new sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. And this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, ignored, or treated as less than human. The stakes had never been higher, and Lisa knew the road ahead would be dangerous. But for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom was packed once again, with even more people than before. The tension in the air was palpable, a quiet hum of anticipation rippling through the crowd as they waited for the judge to return. Lisa sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting on the smooth wood in front of her, her heart pounding. She had spent the last week preparing herself for this moment. But now that it was here, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. Detective Susan Hayes had been true to her word. After their late-night conversation, she had worked tirelessly to gather the evidence needed to expose the rogue officers within the precinct. Lissa had been her strongest witness, recounting every detail of her arrest and identifying Officer Brad Larkin as the silent figure who had watched everything unfold. With each new piece of information, the story became clearer and darker. Susan had uncovered records of coordinated efforts by a small group of officers to target vulnerable individuals in the community under the guise of maintaining order. Their actions were deliberate, their motives veiled in a warped sense of superiority. Lissa's case wasn't just an isolated incident, it was the tip of the iceberg. Now, as the judge entered the room, all eyes turned to him. He sat down, his face as serious as ever, and opened a thick folder in front of him. Lissa held her breath, her pulse racing as she waited for him to speak. "This case has taken an unexpected turn," the judge began, his voice steady. "What initially appeared to be a single act of misconduct has revealed a systemic issue within the police department. The evidence presented by Detective Hayes and the testimony provided by Ms. Carter has shed light on a disturbing pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored." Jake Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been cooperating with the investigation since his confession, but the guilt weighed on him heavily. Beside him, Brad Larkin sat stoically, his expression unreadable. The actions of Officer Daniels, though misguided, were heavily influenced by the culture within his precinct, the judge continued. However, that does not absolve him of responsibility. Nor does it excuse the actions of Officer Larkin and others who knowingly participated in or facilitated these unlawful practices. Lisa's hands clenched into fists under the table. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but the anxiety was almost unbearable. The judge turned to Jake. "Officer Daniels, while your cooperation with the investigation is noted, your actions cannot go unpunished. You are hereby sentenced to 6 months suspension without pay and mandatory retraining. This court expects you to reflect deeply on the responsibility you hold as a law enforcement officer." Jake nodded, his face pale. He had expected worse, but the shame of his actions would stay with him far longer than any punishment. Then the judge turned to Brad Larkin. "Officer Larkin, the evidence against you is damning. Your role in orchestrating and perpetuating these practices is not only a violation of your duty, but a betrayal of the community you swore to protect. You are hereby dismissed from your position and will face criminal charges for your actions." A murmur spread through the courtroom as the words sank in. Brad's expression didn't waver, but Lissa saw the slight twitch of his jaw, a small crack in his stoic facade. But just as the tension began to ease, the judge spoke again. "Before I conclude, I must address an unexpected development." Lisa's heart sank. "What now?" The judge reached for a second folder, this one thinner than the first. During the investigation, additional evidence came to light. Evidence that suggests someone within the department was actively working to cover up these activities. This person has yet to be identified, but their actions have undoubtedly contributed to the harm done to Ms. Carter and others. The room erupted in whispers, the shock palpable. Lissa exchanged a worried glance with Kim, who was seated in the gallery. A cover-up? The thought was both horrifying and infuriating. "I urge anyone with knowledge of this matter to come forward," the judge said firmly. "Justice cannot prevail without transparency." As the judge finished his statement and adjourned the court, Lissa felt a mix of emotions: relief that the officers responsible for her ordeal were being held accountable, anger at the revelation of a deeper conspiracy, and determination to see this fight through to the end. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers as Lissa emerged. Reporters swarmed her, microphones thrust forward as questions flew. But Lissa didn't stop. She held Marcus's hand tightly, his small fingers gripping hers with quiet reassurance. As they reached the edge of the crowd, a familiar figure stepped forward, Thomas Reed, the civil rights attorney. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "If you're ready, I believe we have a strong case to pursue a civil suit against the department." Lissa looked at him, then at Marcus, and finally at Kim. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's do it," she said. But as they walked away, Lissa couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The cover-up hinted at something bigger, something more insidious. And while she had won this battle, the war for justice was far from finished. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps, Lissa knew one thing for certain. She would keep fighting, no matter what. For Marcus, for her community, and for every person who deserved a voice in a system that had silenced them for far too long.